Hello, my name is Colby Voss, and for my research project this semester I focused on how propaganda influenced soldier morale during the American Revolution. The goal of this study was to show how things like Revolutionary era newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides did much more than spread information around the nation, but instead they sustained morale and ideological commitment of soldiers through different things like language, um, liberty, divine purpose, virtue. Propaganda helped transform kind of ordinary colonists into citizen soldiers who believed their service was both a civic and a sacred duty. So historians for a long time, especially in the American Revolution, have talked about uh, the fact that the battle was as much of a mental battle as it was a physical battle. So I used a lot of different scholars to kind of interpret this framework and better understand it. Some particular scholars of note would be Carl Berger in his work Broadsides and Bayonets, to talk about how pamphlets and prints work to unify Americans through symbols like virtue and liberty. Um, One limitation of this source is that Berger focuses a lot on civilians, and my research was more focused on Continental soldiers and how they interpreted the media to sustain them through the war. Another key work is T.H. Breen's The Marketplace of Revolution, which talks about economic boycotts and print culture and the role they played in creating a community of political communication, which explains how soldiers would later interpret the hardship that they were enduring as a moral sacrifice. I also use Pauline Myers from Resistance to Revolution, which traces how early pamphleteers turned grievances into moral resolve, which kind of provides intellectual formula for propaganda. I also use Carol Sue Humphrey and David Copeland's work, The American Revolution in the Press, which talks about newspapers as networks of moral exhortation and not just networks for communication and news. And then finally, I use Charles Royster's Revolutionary People at War, um, in which he talks about morale that soldiers had um, that bound them together during the revolution, um, which connects to my argument because it uh, connects the fact that emotional unity and ideological revolution and ideological reinforcement were supplied by propaganda to soldiers in the war. Um, but the limitations to those were that they're all either focused on civilians or really broad frameworks, and I wanted to see how soldiers interpreted the news. So to do that, I used a collection of the Davenport letters from James Davenport, who was a Continental soldier from 1778 to 1783. Um, and I examined his letters to analyze better how soldiers interpreted um, the news and propaganda to shape their morale. One of his letters from March 1778 recalls that um, Thomas Paine's common sense stirred, got to go back to the letter here, stirred the men's heart to bear the frost a little longer. So it talks about how um, words became used for endurance as much as they were information. In another letter that he wrote from Morristown in 1780, he talked about the fact that broadsides from Congress declared perseverance as a virtue from God. So kind of connecting the religious symbology and revolutionary propaganda, transforming it into aspects of righteousness that they could have. Um, so again, these letters are particularly important because they show that the news wasn't just localized in one place or in the hands of the elite or the civilians, but it was transformed and reinterpreted within the ranks of the Continental Army. Officers would read newspapers aloud, chaplains would use pamphlets and use the language in their sermons. So print sort of becomes like a ritual and helps soldiers find purpose in what they're doing. So one of the things that makes this research so significant is the fact that propaganda has long roots in American history as a psychological supply for soldiers' mental sustainment and their desire to keep fighting. So in the American Revolution, things like civic virtue, providence, and emotional persuasion help soldiers endure the hardships and the length of the war. A really kind of key quote from James Davenport from a letter he wrote in 1783 in Newburgh. Davenport says, "The words of our leaders kept the spirit alive when our bellies were empty." Right, so it kind of encapsulates what I'm looking at, the fact that propaganda and information and news from the Revolutionary era was used by soldiers as a way to endure the hardships that they were facing in the war.